Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to all of our attendees tuning in from around the world. Today's broadcast of Invisible Women in Sport is an Institute for Sport and Social Justice production. I am your producer, Garnett Overby III. All guests will be muted during this production, but I encourage you to use the chat feature to ask a question or leave a comment. We will reserve time at the end to answer your questions. So now, without further ado, I would like to welcome our host, Candace Martin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Candace Martin. Welcome to season 3, episode 13 of Invisible Women in Sport. And I am your host. Today, you are all in for a treat as I am sitting down and having a conversation with Dr. Breanna Robinson, Senior Associate Director of Athletics for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and might I add, Sport Administration at the University of Illinois. Thanks so much, Breanna, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Candace.
Absolutely. So we chatted the other day in the pre-screen. I said we're either going to do 2 truths and a lie or rapid fire. You did call me out and say you didn't watch an episode with me doing 2 truths and a lie, so we're actually going to do 2 truths and a lie because it has been a while.
Fair enough.
It's just so hard for me to think of statements that nobody knows, and it's just so tough for me. So I'll go first.
Okay.
All righty. So I cannot skate. My mom and I share middle names, and I love to cook in my crock pot. So what do you all think is not true? Matt says skate. Garnett says cooking. Not even coming from my cooking. Maya says skate. Maya shouldn't have played. Maya knows a little too much. Breanna says skate. All right. All righty. So skate is the one that's incorrect. I can skate. My mom and I pretty much share a birthday, middle names. We share a lot. And I do love to cook in my crock pot. All right. So Breanna, now you go.
All right. So this is really tough because similar to you, I'm an open book. So a lot of people know a lot of different things about me.
Right.
Okay. So the first thing is I was born with extra fingers.
Ooh.
The second thing is I have never been out of the country. And the third thing is I was a walk-on student athlete.
Okay. I think it's never been out of the country. I think that's the lie. That's what I think. Garnett says country. Maya, it's unanimous.
Must have been too easy. I have been out of the country. But I was born with 6 fingers on each hand. So the condition is called polydactyly. So it's a developmental thing when people are developing it in utero, and it is hereditary on the maternal side. So I found that out when I had my own daughter, and she had an extra finger on each hand.
Oh, okay. You didn't tell us in the pre-screen. I know you were a mom. Okay.
I am a mom. I have a 7-year-old daughter, Harper.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. All right. So let's jump right in. So softball standout for those who may or may not know. So, pretty much how did you get your start into the sport industry? What did that initially look like for Breanna?
That's really interesting because I was a follower. I was the tag along with my dad. I was the tag along with my older brother. So my dad started off coaching youth sport when I was tiny. I think I might have been like 4 or 5. And so I was going to his practices, and I remember just hoping and wishing that I would be a cheerleader for his team at some point. So when I got to be of age, he created a coaching position for cheer coach. And so at that point, I got involved there. And so, I started off kind of with cheer, but then quickly transitioned over into baseball. And so the joke that I started off with was really with my mom and dad. My older brother was getting ready for baseball practice during preseason conditioning. And I saw him getting ready, and I was like, I want to go. I want to be on the baseball team. And I said it jokingly, not knowing that anyone would take me seriously. And so my dad was like, no. And my mom was like, well, why can't she? And so basically, like when my mom said that, I was like, oh man, like I can't allow her to have egg on her face for standing up for me. So I have to go. And so I went to baseball practice, the only girl. I came downstairs in pink sweatpants, and my dad immediately told me to go back upstairs and change them to something less girly. And so I remember changing my sweatpants, ready to go to baseball practice, and the rest is really history.
Very nice. Similar to you, I'm the baby and only girl of 4. So, I mean, my brothers would play little league football. My dad would be out coaching, but my mom was very much so like, this is the only girl and she's going to be the girl. So, you know, I was very much so cheering on the sideline. That's pretty much where I started also. So started out pretty much in youth sports, you know. So when actually did it resonate with you? You actually want to work within the sport industry?
I think for me, it didn't resonate until later. I really tried to fight it for a long time. And I think when I look at my trajectory, just academically and athletically, people always knew that I was athletically talented, but I wanted people to recognize and acknowledge me outside of sport. And so I really tried to distance myself from anything connected to sport in an industry after I started to get further along in my academic career. So from the very first time that I can remember of someone asking me, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I remember like documents from 3rd grade that my parents still have where I indicated that I wanted to be a WNBA basketball player. But from an administrative standpoint, I never knew that a position like the one that I have right now existed until I got to college. And so it really wasn't until I got into grad school that I started considering what this might look like if I pursued sport as an occupation outside of being a professional athlete.
Absolutely. So with kind of a late start, because I believe that I kind of had one too, going into undergrad, I went to physical therapy. I really didn't realize that people actually worked within sport. Although I was a collegiate athlete, it's a little weird. I didn't realize that people actually worked within sport. So how did you, during that time, may have been a little bit later to the game, so to speak, how did you gain the experience that aided you in getting to where you are now?
So it really started a little bit during undergrad with one of my professors, Dr. Fennell. I have to give him a shout out because he was so impactful. I was a public health promotion major. And so in that major, he was really the only Black faculty member, but he was also just really challenging and really believed in making sure that you were credible and making sure you had factual information. And so he was one of those people that was like, well, what are you passionate about? And that was my junior year of college. So imagine not ever really thinking, what am I going to do next as you are a junior in college? And so I was a little bit panicked because I'm like, this is the first time someone has asked me and I don't even know how to get to that point. Right. And we had all of the life skills programming. We had all of the mentors and advisors and all of the things that student athletes have in college to be able to navigate the career prep piece. But I really didn't start to think that, this could be long-term for me with being able to help people and being able to influence and shape people's lives. So what I did when I went to grad school and where Dr. Fennell fits in is the first year of grad school, really what I did is I interned in the Student Athlete Academic Support Services office as a graduate intern. And then I also worked for one of my mentors and my sport administrator for softball at the time, Kiana Smith. And so she allowed me to work with game operations. So I saw really the full picture of the function of athletics from a lot of different angles. Yeah. And so that kind of intrigued me. So fast forward to second year of graduate school and Dr. Fennell was like, hey, I have a graduate assistantship for you. And I turned him down. Oh. And so imagine that, right? Like my mom is like, are you crazy? Because he had like a graduate assistantship with a stipend. And here I am working hourly and paying student loans. But it was because he had always told me, like, do what you're passionate about. And so at that point in time, I really started to think about, okay, I don't think I want to do anything in public health promotion, but I would like to see what's out there for me in athletics. And so that was really my start. And so that second year of grad school gave me an opportunity to work with students on campus in the Campus Learning Center to have a basis of comparison to really understand what my career longevity might look like in athletics.
Absolutely. So I do appreciate you mentioning that, like, it's okay to say no if you're not necessarily passionate about what you're doing. I absolutely love that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I've learned throughout my career that you have to be sure of what you want because it's not worth it to just say yes for yes sake.
Absolutely. So you started out public health and then you went over into, so at what point did it become DE&I? When did that interest kind of spark? Because oftentimes we hear about DE&I and a lot of people of color, Black people end up in the DE&I space. So was that something that you saw yourself doing, that you aimed for? Was it something that kind of was presented to you?
Candace, I never saw myself doing diversity, equity. And I've joked with my former supervisor about this, and I was like, I really had no skills that I thought of to be prepared and equipped to do this work. But what I think happened is people constantly heard me talking about access and equity in rooms that I was in. And so as we were sitting in meetings and I was helping student athletes navigate their academic career, they heard me talking about these things. What does it look like for this student athlete who's from a first generation household and they're first generation college student? Or what does it look like for a student athlete filling out FAFSA and their parents have never gone through this before, or maybe is a newly single parent, right? And so there were a lot of those things that people heard in rooms that I think gave them the understanding and idea that I might be a person who is qualified enough to do the job. And so immediately upon receiving a DEI role, there was a lot of learning, right? Because I'm not sure I think there are more people now, but I'm not sure at the time how many people were really coming out guns a-blazing saying, yes, this is what I want to do in an athletic department, because it was such an uncharted territory.
Absolutely. So now you're talking about rooms that you've been in rooms where you're the person that's advocating for individuals who may not be in those rooms, individuals who may not be able to advocate for themselves, and individuals who may not know how to advocate for themselves. So too often we hear about Black women and women in general in various administrative roles and just having seats at these tables. They're often calculating how they communicate or advocate for individuals. So how have you maneuvered that working on PWI campuses, being the only woman in a room on an executive staff or the only Black woman in a room, how have you maneuvered that space?
I've been very fortunate the last two institutions that I've worked at, which I was a part of the executive staff, to not have to worry about being the only one. I think both of the athletic directors that I worked with and work with now, Josh Whitman, has been very intentional and vocal and upfront about making sure that there's a seat at the table, and not just for people who look like me, but people who look different from me and different from him, right. And people who have different ideas and understandings of the world and college athletics and how we support student athletes. But I have talked to lots of colleagues who that isn't their experience, right? They receive a designation and a role, but maybe that designation or role does not sit around that table as a part of an executive staff. And it makes it really challenging because ultimately they don't have the opportunity to be the first set of eyes or one of the first voices in the room to provide insight as to what that policy is, or to what the change is that's coming, or maybe how you support staff, student athletes, and coaches. And so I have been very fortunate to be at institutions that really value diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not just in a singular way, but in a multifaceted way.
Absolutely. So now we're talking about your role in DE&I as a senior associate athletic director. So, how would you explain your job to someone, i.e. me, to someone with no knowledge? I have very little knowledge, kind of on what the day-to-day looks like for someone that works in DE&I. So if you could shed some light on that with us, I'm sure we greatly appreciate that.
Yes. So really my role is two different roles, but I always like to say neither one of them are mutually exclusive from one another. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, essentially I am responsible for creating a culture of equity, respect, understanding, empathy within our athletic department. And so that's between student athletes, that's with staff, that's with coaches, and serving as the liaison between the athletic department as well as campus. On the sports administration side, I always tell people I coach coaches and the coaches coach the student athletes. So really providing oversight and supervision over all aspects of the program from an administrative standpoint, and assisting coaches in really navigating what it is to be a head coach currently, right? But also being able to provide insight as necessary to navigating matters concerning student athletes and just our department.
Absolutely. So your time as a student athlete on campus, how has that aided in you being able to provide for and advocate for the student athletes that you serve today? How has that impacted you?
Wow. I think I had a lot of people who realized that I was more than just an athlete. And that has really been integral in shaping how I approach this work in supporting people, right? So when you look at our student athletes, you understand that they're multidimensional individuals that have a variety of identities that they're bringing to the table, and those that may be more or less important at any given point in time. So when I think about it, I'm not thinking about them just as a student or an athlete. I'm thinking about them as a sibling, as a child, as a niece or a nephew, what have you, some of them parents, right? And thinking about them in those aspects of their identities to be able to show up and support them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So now I kind of want to talk about, your network. A lot of time on the show, me as a young professional, my ENA, we're always trying to figure out the sweet spot when it comes to identifying who to add to our network, but then also identifying what works for both parties when it comes to communicating. How often is enough? How often is not enough? So how have you figured out the sweet spot, so to speak, what works for you, what works for the individuals within your network? How have you used that, or how has that been able to impact your career?
So I can say that it looks different now than it did before, just because of the responsibilities that I have day to day. But when I first started out in the field, because I had no idea really what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go, it was a lot of me shoulder tapping people and asking questions, right? So I'll name drop here. So Dr. Ashley Baker is a friend of mine and a mentor. And I can say, like, without a doubt, if Ashley hadn't have let me shadow her when I was a graduate student, like, I would not be here today. And so what that looked like for me when I was a graduate student is I knew that Miami University was in line along I-75 and going back north to go home to Toledo, Ohio. And it was in line with, two other major universities in the same conference. And so what I did is I reached out to the administrators at those institutions. And at the time, Ashley was the director of academic support services and athletics. And I reached out to her, and she said, absolutely, you can come job shadow me. And it wasn't just like a half-day job shadow. It was like, come in and be with me all day. I went into coaches meetings with her. Like, think about that. Like, that's unheard of.
Yeah.
That's unheard of. And so, and not just, like one coaches meeting, but then there were student athlete meetings that she allowed me to be a part of. And it was unique and interesting because that's a very sacred space.
Right.
She gave me a campus tour. And again, even though my house was 30 minutes from that campus, I didn't go to undergrad or grad school there. And so it was very impactful for me just to see how she approached her student athletes, how she navigated difficult conversations with coaches. There was a point in time, I remember the basketball coach at the time, he was like, can we have a second? Right. But it was just the initial introduction and allowing me to see how she navigated those relationships and those interactions. So I thought that was very helpful for me. And then the other thing is we just followed up, and she, tracked and kind of made sure that I was good to go when I started my first full-time job. What is transition to look like at this point in time? There's a lot of emails back and forth. And so what I'll say to anyone watching who's a young professional or who's a graduate student entering into or has desires to enter into college athletics or any space is really take the opportunity to look through some of the directories of some of the athletic departments. You may not have an understanding of where you want to work at this given point in time, but you can certainly look in the directory to see what are the different titles that people have that maybe intrigue you in the areas that you might be interested in going into, and just send them an email. Send them an email, try to get on their schedule. I know for me, if someone reaches out to me, I always try to make sure that I reach out back. and respond, just because I know what it's like trying to get your start, trying to build your network. And so I think that that's a critical piece, is just making sure that you send those emails, make those phone calls, and following up. And sometimes after you establish that initial contact, it might just be you sending a text message or you sending an email every once in a while to say, hey, it's been a while. How are you doing? Or, do you have time, if it's in person, to go grab lunch? Those things are really helpful because people get really busy and it's really easy to lose track of time, but maybe just setting calendar reminders once a month or once every few months to be able to check in on your people once you make
I
connections.
think that's a good nugget, because I think there's a misconception that it should be more frequent. And a lot of people are busy, or it's just, if you're talking, you may not have much to talk about. So then it's probably a little too often. So it's okay if it, a few months go by or a month goes by. Just reach out to say, hi, hello, what's going on? Here's what I'm doing. Hope we can chat and catch up soon. I found that to work also. So it's really good. But I did enjoy the nugget about, if you're traveling, maybe look to see what your past, where you're going through, and to be able to set something up that way also. So that's a good tip.
Yeah.
All right, so I kind of want to put you on the spot a little bit. Well, first I'm going to ask, what is the process like for implementing a DE&I program? What does that process look like?
So I can tell you what it looks like for me and has looked like for me. Because at my last institution, I did it from scratch. When I came here, there were some pieces that were already in place. And again, credit to Josh Whitman and the staff that is here for making that a priority. At the time that I did it in 2017, when I was at Miami University, it was simply establishing an understanding of like, what were the expectations, right? When you talk about being charged with an assignment or given a task and creating something from, the ground up, it was really understanding like, what does this look like? Do we want to have a website? What does that website look like? Who's included? And before you even get to the point of putting things on the website, like, what are you going to put on there? What programs and initiatives do you have? What resources do you have to be able to connect people? And so all of those things had to be in place. Events, right? Whether that's connected to a campus events calendar for DEI, or whether that is connected to an internal within your athletic department calendar for DEI. So some of those things were involved. I also created a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. And so that was already established when I got here, but those are some of the bare bones pieces. And then I think, thinking very broadly, is it student athletes that are going to be a part of certain groups? Is it going to be staff and coaches that are a part of other groups? Are you going to have student athlete affinity groups? And do you have the bandwidth to be able to support them and people in the department who value it in the same way to be able to be advisors to these groups? And I want to say, not just necessarily value it, but also have the time,
Right?
Because it is a time commitment. And so that's some of the diversity, equity, inclusion implementation piece, just very broad scale. When you talk about what it might look like to be able to really make some noise in an athletic department and start to move things around and shift things around to make sure that that it's a priority. Here, I know, one of the things that we're doing right now, we're venturing upon, is a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan. And so what that allows us to do is not just have a guessing game of what's important and what should we do. It's a formal assessment process, and moving through that to really allow the people within your community to inform the things that you're doing. And so those are some nuggets and some pieces of, what that looks like in terms of implementation. And then on the hiring side, just making sure that you have individuals who are either a part of your diversity inclusion committee or people who are just diverse voices. And that could be, whether you're talking about sexual orientation or race or ability, what have you, represented as a part of hiring committees, so that people can have opportunities for professional development, but also have opportunities to ask the necessary questions, and keeping DEI at the forefront.
Absolutely. So a lot more moving pieces than the average person would have anticipated, i.e. me, once again, would have anticipated goes into DE&I, a lot of things that we don't see that go on behind the scenes. So I do appreciate you shedding light on that. So now I kind of want to put you on the spot. So what initiative have you worked on from start to finish are you most proud of, and why?
So I think it hasn't been here yet. I think in progress right now is definitely the strategic plan.
Okay.
I think that it is integral to where we're headed and where we're going. I always like to think about, again, the multiple identities of the people who make up the fabric of an organization. And I want to make sure that we're doing our very best, not just striving, not just trying, right? But we actually are giving our very best to be able to show up, value people's identities, allow for authenticity in our space, and really support people as they are. Wow. And so this has been a heavy lift. You know, I started almost a year ago, actually a year ago last week, in this position. And I immediately hit the ground running, trying to learn the environment, and not just necessarily our environment and our culture within the athletic department, but also in the surrounding community and also on campus. So I think those have been the things that I'm really proud of, as I've managed to insert myself in ways, develop some partnerships and relationships with folks across campus, as well as within our athletic department, to be able to understand and give some context and insight to where we might want to go.
Nice. So in the midst of all that, you're a mom, you know, balancing so many responsibilities and duties, senior associate athletic director for DEI and sport admin. How does Breanna recharge and reset? We must know, you know, what does she do? With something, you got to be doing something, you know, in that little free time that you do have. You know, how do you recharge?
So I am a big massage, mani-pedi person. Those are my things, right? Like, I need to be able to have my nails done. You can see my nails are done right now. I need to have my nails done. I need to have a good pedi, massages, those types of things to recharge. Absolutely. But I will say, I've been so fortunate, and I don't want to sound cliche by any means, but I've been so fortunate to work with people that I absolutely enjoy. And so when you work with people you absolutely enjoy, and that's not to say that days aren't difficult, but when you work with people that you truly care about and you know care about you, it makes all the difference, because, you know, we know that come August 22nd until sometime early in June that it's going to be a marathon, but it really doesn't feel so burdensome, or it doesn't feel like, you know, you're so stressed out that you can't manage it, or you're burned out, because there are people who are there to help you. And so I think that that's been really helpful for me, is just being able to communicate, like, hey, if I am having a moment, hey, I'm having a moment, and being vulnerable and transparent about what that looks like, so that other people can help take care of me too.
Yeah, absolutely. So surrounding yourself, doing the research on the company's culture, just surrounding yourself with people who, you know, will support you when you need the support, and vice versa, where it's mutual. That way you don't feel like you're working. Or it's not stressful.
Absolutely.
All righty, friends. So I'm coming up on my last question. So please begin to put your questions in the chat for Breanna, so Maya can take us through Q&A. All righty, Breanna. So, question I like to wrap up the show with all my guests. What would you tell your younger self? What do you know now, or you may be still trying to learn today, that you wish you had known when you were younger?
So I'm going to start by telling a story to answer this question. So when I was a senior in high school, I cried every single day because I didn't think that I was going to be able to have an opportunity to go to college and play sport. I was the younger sister of an absolute standout athlete, and all I wanted to do and all I had worked for and given my all to was my craft in sport. And so for me, I was really concerned that I wasn't going to have an opportunity to do that. And when I got to college, I still made the decision to follow my brother to Miami University. And when I got to college, I already knew that I was just going to be a traditional student. And so after a few weeks, the coach reached out to me that had already told me before that there was no opportunity for me to walk on, and asked me if I was interested in walking on. And so I emailed her back, because at that time, text messaging was not a thing. I emailed her back and I said, yes, I am. Now, you have to keep in mind, it had been several weeks into school. I hadn't conditioned. I didn't work out all summer in that way to be able to train. So we're talking about a dynamic warm up that felt like it was true conditioning around the softball field. So I had the opportunity to go out with the team and practice, and that served as my walk-on tryout. And so thinking about how all of this came to fruition and came to be, and I earned a scholarship after my first year, it really is a testament to the fact that things aren't always linear or sequential, and they may not always look the way that things may not always look the way for you that they do for the person sitting next to you. And so I think that I would tell my younger self that it's okay if things are out of order and things are not linear or sequential, that I need to embrace the ambiguity and the unknowns and the uncertainties of what's to come, because it'll be okay.
Absolutely. So trust in the process.
Absolutely.
That's what I heard. And it's hard. It's definitely hard. But they say when it works out and you look back, it's just like, we was overreacting just a splash, we get a little bit much there. And look at us now. So I definitely appreciate it. Well, Breanna, it has been a pleasure sitting and chatting with you. I am now going to throw it over to Maya to take it over for Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Candace.
Yeah.
Okay. And selfishly, I'm going to start with one of my questions first.
Okay.
So in the pre-screen and today, you talked about being lucky that you worked for institutions and people that align with your morals. So as we start looking for jobs, what are some things that you looked for or would suggest us to look for in those institutions when we're applying?
So the first thing I would tell you is just be sure of what your values are. I think for me, it's been a process, right? But I know that my core values are integrity, accountability, and respect, whether we're talking about personally or professionally. And so those things for me don't change regardless of what the situation is. And I think that if you understand what your core values are, then you're able to ask critical questions to organizations as you're going throughout the interview process. The other thing is being able to look, there are some symbolic things, right, that people have on their websites for you to be able to do some research prior to going on an interview. And so those things are able to tell you what they stand for, but then be able to align your questions when you're meeting with them to inquire a little bit more to learn about the organization and really how all of it is connected throughout. Maybe sometimes those responsibilities or those things you might see on the website from a DI standpoint might be connected to one person, but other times it may not be communicated that multiple people are involved. And so I think those are critical pieces to be able to sit down and develop your questions based off of what your values are and also what they communicate their values are.
Mm-hmm. I think we've talked a lot, especially lately, we've talked a lot about like being able to interview the institutions or colleges or whatever back the same way that they're interviewing us and making sure that it really is a good fit before we end up in a job or in a state or whatever, and we're not able to serve in those positions as we would have somewhere else. So I think that's really good advice. Our first question in the chat comes from Matt Edelson, which you kind of touched on a little bit earlier, but could you talk about some of the DE&I initiatives that you're implementing? How did you get buy-in on these projects from coaches and administrators?
So, like I mentioned before, we had quite a few initiatives already started here when I got to the University of Illinois. But, one of the things that I'm working on right now, I talked about the assessment piece, right? So we talked about being able to learn and understand what those experiences are of our student athletes, our coaches, and our staff. And the strategic plan is one big initiative in and of itself, because people are going to have to be in agreement with what we're recommending as a result of the assessment. And so I think it's about having conversations. I think, what I've learned is that you can't go very far if you haven't established relationships with the people that you're asking to buy in. And so they have to know that you're trustworthy. And they also have to know, what it is that you're trying to accomplish and achieve. And so I think that transparency is necessary in order to get buy-in from people. But then along the lines of just some initiatives that are already in place, I think understanding that, we have certain affinity groups to be able to serve our student athletes, but maybe recrafting some of those affinity groups for the student athletes to understand that there's not just the social aspect of it, but there's the service aspect as well as the education and advocacy standpoint. And so those are two big things I think right now immediately in front of me that I'm really working on to get our student athletes really mobile and active and involved in the community in a way, and working with our student athlete development staff to be able to do that.
And I think that kind of goes back to making sure that you're working with people or for institutions that like also have the same morals as you. Not everyone is going to agree, but at least you know that there's a team behind you that are also supporting the projects that you're trying to put in place.
Absolutely.
Our next question in the chat comes from Garnett Overby, who asks, what are areas in sport that we need more women of color leadership? What would you suggest as first steps to this change?
Yeah, I think what immediately comes to mind is just head coach representation. And then I think also just administrators in senior or executive roles. We oftentimes sit around our executive staff table and we have conversations about who we're bringing into the fold or how we're going to go about hiring or promoting, and being very honest with ourselves about what that looks like for us long term and why diverse perspectives, and again, not just people of color, right, but people who have different experiences in different industries, or people who might come from a different state but have some sort of understanding of things that we might be approaching. And so I think that administratively we need more, because we have a lot of student athletes that have identities, whether you're talking about international student athletes or you're talking about student athletes of color or first generation, that don't necessarily always have the connecting points that they need across college athletics because there aren't people for them to look to and connect with in that way. And so that can be kind of scary for students, or it can be kind of scary for coaches trying to find those connecting points to be able to either support their student athletes, or even as they're talking to recruits and building and establishing relationships with those people, to get people who are incoming to understand that we do have the resources to be able to support you. And so I think one of the pieces of creating that change and turning the tide is really being intentional about hiring practices, right? Who are you recruiting, and how are you recruiting them? Where are you posting your positions? How are you defining and identifying people as being qualified? We oftentimes hear people say that someone is a great fit. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that they have the skills that are necessary and required to be able to do the job? Or does that mean that you think that they'll agree with you and jive with the staff in terms of your comfort level? And so I can say, honestly, like the best hires that I've made in athletic departments have been the people that I'm least comfortable with at times, because I know that they may not think like me. They may not come from the same areas as me in terms of they might not be from the Midwest. They might be from the West Coast, right? Or they might not be from the United States. But those hires are necessary for us to be able to really, again, diversify a staff and be able to support the people who are in the space, because they offer us differing perspectives and it's not groupthink.
Mm-hmm. Our next question in the chat comes from Iane Miranda, who asks, what is advice you have for young professionals who aspire to work in leadership positions?
That is an excellent question, as I am currently hiring. So I think one of the things that I've seen that have shifted is, when I got into the industry, there were a lot of things that I did for not a lot of pay, right? And some of those things I did in terms of getting extra experience would be staying extra hours. I might have been getting paid for it, but I stayed extra hours and offered to do other things in addition. So there's part of that, right? Understandably, there's privilege built in there, because not everyone can afford to work and not get paid for it. But if you're a student, right, and you are whether a graduate student or an undergraduate student right now, to be able to go somewhere and volunteer. Someone shared a story with me the other day of how they got their start here in Illinois athletics. They just continued to show up and volunteer in spaces. And then when an opportunity opened up, they were the person that someone thought of. And so I think that there are opportunities for people to do things like that, to volunteer. I think about my opportunity to be a part of the Final Four. When I lived in Atlanta, it wasn't necessarily a part of my job when I was working at Georgia Tech, but it was something that I did as an opportunity for professional development. And so, again, continuing to get as much experience as you can to lean into, like, what are those things outside of my scope that I don't know as much about that I could afford to learn more about, to really understand and narrow in a little bit on what I would like to do, but also give me perspective of the full picture of what this operation is.
Yeah, so temporary uncomfort, or giving things up in order to see success in the end.
Yes, absolutely. Be comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Then my last question that comes from me, we talked a little bit earlier about people of color being pigeonholed in DE&I roles solely because they are, people of color. So what are some resources that you can suggest for them or for us to be an asset to our organizations in those roles?
I think, to me, what I've done is I've just tried to make sure that I connect myself, right, with people across institutions within the conference, outside of the conference, to make sure that, I'm connecting myself and not coming to this work from a singular lens. And so I think being able to develop a network of people that outside of your organization are also within your organization, who can be able to support you and offer insights, but also connect you to other people, getting on podcasts, being a part, like Women Leaders is a great resource, right? And making sure that, I say this all the time, like Zoom is a thing, right? And we understand that Zoom is a thing, but have your camera on Zoom and ask one question to be able to make sure that you're connecting with folks so that they know who you are, and you're able to then start a relationship with them and develop another circle of support. And so those things have been valuable to me in really just discovering who my people are to be able to support me.
The power of a team.
The power of a team, absolutely.
That's my last question, so I'll send it back to Candace to close out the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Maya.
Thanks, Maya and Breanna. That was phenomenal. I did enjoy what you mentioned about interviewing, what you and Maya kind of put together as far as interviewing organization that you're also interviewing for. It's just as important that you are the right fit for them as they are the right fit for you, especially if it's somewhere you're going to be even for 6 months. It could completely alter your experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I must ask for the people in the back, what exactly are you hiring for right now?
I am hiring for a visiting diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator role. And so it is posted. It came out in D1 Ticker, and it's also posted on the Illinois website. So I can share that with you for you to share across your networks, because that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about it here when we jump off first. Because myself, Mike, and Iane were all finishing up the program in December, but we'll chat.
Alrighty.
All right, friends. So thank you so much, Breanna, for joining us and the Invisible Women in Sport team. Now we are going to close out the show.
Thank you.
All righty, friends. We thank you all for your support of Invisible Women in Sport. We're a nonprofit organization with other programs that impact various social justice issues. Please use the QR code on your screen to support us with a financial gift as we continue to change the lives through the power of sport. Once again, thanks to our team and our special guest, Dr. Breanna Robinson, for joining us. We would like to extend a special shout out to the University of Illinois Athletics for allowing Breanna to spend some time with us today. All right, you guys know the drill. Please follow us on all social media platforms to stay up to date and informed on future programs at Institute SSJ. If you ever miss an episode, we've got you covered on our YouTube channel. We have all of our episodes posted and up to date. All righty, friends, we all get a lot of inquiries about internships that are open. If you or any of our supporters have any internships open or currently available, please send your information to our producer, Guardian Overby, at gob@sportandsocialjustice.org, so we can send it out to the individuals reaching out to us. Also, we need your feedback. Following today's episode, you will receive a brief survey. Please, please, please fill that out as we are continuing to improve the Invisible Women in Sport Zoomcast. Tune in on September 8th for season 3, episode 14 at 2 p.m., where I will have a chat with Miss Rachel Melendez-Maybe, the program specialist for PGA Works at PGA Reach. It's a mouthful, but you guys should definitely register. You're in for a treat. Be on the lookout for that registration link. And once again, I am your host, Candace Martin of Invisible Women in Sport. See us now. Thanks everyone for tuning in.